Hi everyone, it's been a while, I know. I'm about ready to start heading my way back out of the bush and headed for home. The lighting angles and whatnot are not great. I haven't been able to find a good spot, so you'll have to excuse the lighting in this video. I wanted to talk a little bit about where I'm kind of at with regards to this whole reset that we're sort of all going through. And, you know, at the early part of the lockdowns, for lack of a better term, in North America, I didn't think too much about it other than I sort of was against the idea in the first place. I thought it was ill-advised. I thought maybe the better thing to do would be to protect those at risk and have the rest of us, you know, develop herd immunity and, economic immunity, hopefully, for everyone by continuing to keep everything afloat. And I got busy enough in the shop, I was already busy anyway, that, you know, I was sort of just nose to the grindstone as usual. From that point until now, and up to and including the holidays that I'm just coming towards the end of now, that I decided to take. I normally take some time off in May. Definitely needed it this year with everything that's going on and just how busy I was in the shop. In that time frame, I've become increasingly disheartened with what I see, and I think some of that informs the thought processes that I'm going through right now with respect to how this might affect me going forward, how I interact with people, how much news and just current events that I kind of consume, what I do in the shop, how hard do I work between now and retirement, and how might those kind of things be modified from what I was already thinking. I mean, I was already thinking, you know, at some point that I would go to a 4-day work week or something like that. You know, does that change now? Am I going to move that up? Am I going to look, you know, at doing something else entirely? Who knows? These are ongoing negotiations, let's say, during hot tub deliberations. When I say that I've been increasingly disheartened by what I see, I'm referring in particular to what I see as the madness of crowds, the ever-increasing complacency within people, and the ever-increasing willingness to go along with sort of what I would consider to be authoritarian dictates in otherwise free countries where there's actually a Bill of Rights, a Constitution, a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, things that are supposed to guarantee certain things, and how easily those things are sidestepped with a decree, a policy about, you know, emergency declarations and that sort of thing. And I'm not saying that those things are wrong-headed or ill-advised or anything like that. I am, but that's an argument for another video or day or whatever. I mean, I think that every argument needs to stand on its own merits. And so, for instance, I saw someone commented on a comment that I left on a video about Christians, the Bible, their adherence to it, you know, claims made that, it speaks the truth and you should be following Scripture, but how much do they really follow Scripture? And should you hold Christians to account for that if they're going to tell you that their theology represents an accurate reflection of the nature of our existence? Then why is it that they themselves are not following, to that degree? And I'd left a comment there, and somebody had commented, "Oh, here you are. I see you're still alive. I used to subscribe to your channel, but I think I unsubscribed when you started talking about," and this is probably not the word they used, but the wrong-headed, they used a different word, but wrong-headed anti-SJW and anti-feminist topics. Now, I don't think I ever really got too heavily involved in anti-SJW and anti-feminist. I do know that there were a few videos that I made, particularly when I was making some videos back at my dad's house after my dad had passed, and I was sort of going out there to check on things periodically, and my brother and I were cleaning things up. And I made some pretty lengthy videos about modern-day feminists and social justice activists. And I think I made some pretty decent arguments in those videos. I cringe at the labels. I think that's the point that I was going to make here, is that, this person's talking about anti-SJW and anti-feminist, and those carry a lot of baggage, those terms. as do the terms feminist and social justice warrior and far left or leftist and right winger. Those all carry baggage, and I cringe at those labels because they tend to be a little bit dog whistly, depending on the crowd you're talking to. And I've had to use them in the past just to try to distinguish a group I might be addressing. And I've faced backlash, and I think rightfully so, for using those terms in the past. Even though, I mean, you gotta, at some point, you gotta put a label on something. But because of the amount of baggage that those things carry, and really, my point back to this person, I haven't commented in response yet, but I'm going to, is to say, well, I'm not anti-feminist and anti-SJW, at least not in the way I think you're referencing. But either way, the arguments should stand on their own merits. So, I mean, unsubscribe. There's nobody that says you have to subscribe to me, obviously, or converse with me. But really, unless you were saying, listen, I can't be bothered, I don't even want to deal with those topics. If you're saying I'm wrong-headed, well, let's hear the argument, right? The mosquitoes have found me. It is spring after all. I mean, let's attack the arguments. I'm not an anti-social justice warrior. Do I think that there should be such a thing as social justice? Well, I think people ought to treat each other justly. Generally speaking, to me, that means just leaving people alone that want to be left alone. Voluntary interaction between people. And yes, of course, don't treat someone like an a-hole just because they happen to be of a different race, gender, preference, etc., etc., etc. But that goes both ways, of course. And so without going too far down that road, the point is the arguments need to stand on their own merits. So we could have that discussion about emergency policies and the rightness of that. However, the thing that I'm most concerned about is just the absolute willingness of people to assume that the people in charge know what they're doing, first of all, and that what they're doing is the right thing, and that there could not be any possible ulterior motives, and that it's wrong to be critical of, say, your leadership in the middle of a crisis. Now, I would argue, and I've had this point made to me, along with, defer to the experts, which, I mean, defer to the experts is bad enough in and of itself, because really what was undergirding that is, don't think for yourself. If they tell you, you do, and you accept. Well, my parents didn't raise me like that. My parents raised me to be critical thinking, rational, empirical, skeptical, logical person. And so, yes, a person might be an expert in a field, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't have at least enough intellect to be able to have them explain to me in somewhat layperson's terms what they know, in a way that I can understand it, so that I can decide for my own self what my position is on policy. Of course, I'm a voter, so what I think about policy is important after all. And that doesn't mean I have to understand every, I don't have to be an epidemiologist, and I don't have to be a virologist, I don't have to be a climate scientist, I don't have to be a geologist. But those people should be able to explain to me their what they know, their concept, their theories, in a way that I can understand it so that I can make decisions about policy. Because, of course, when it comes to deferring to the experts, well, there's no one expert that understands every field and is then able to make policy decisions based on every field. They're not an expert in every field. In some ways, it's up to us as citizens to be armchair experts in every field, if nothing else. We gather that information, and ultimately we make, elections have consequences, right? And that's not to say that I've changed my thought processes on democracy being immoral. See my video catalog for video discussions of that. But it is to say that I'm in the system that I'm in. And the second part about deferring to the experts is the experts don't agree. So, of course, then it is important for me to be able to ascertain from all the different experts why they hold the position that they hold based on what they know, and to come to some sort of a conclusion for myself. And let's not forget that the experts often don't agree with themselves. And that's an issue. Now, I'm not talking about when an expert in a field gets new evidence towards a position and changes their position. I'm all for that. I mean, that's the scientific method, essentially, is being skeptical even of your own conclusions already. Scientific theories are not set in stone. There's no such thing as settled science. That's ridiculous. That's an aberration to the methodology itself. But no, I'm talking about an expert who gains all their knowledge through experience, makes proclamations about what ought to be done in the future based on that knowledge, and then when faced with that scenario in the future, does something different. If you want to know what I'm talking about, watch some of Dr. Anthony Fauci's lectures from years past, 2003, 2010, I can't remember all the years. In other words, when he first sort of arrived on the stage as an advisor to the Trump administration on the current situation, I went and I researched him. I think that's what a rational, skeptical, free-thinking adult is supposed to do. I feel like that's incumbent on all of us to do that. So I researched him and I listened to lectures that he was giving on pandemic preparedness at different events that were being held. And I listened very intently to the things that he said ought to be done in the event of a global pandemic or an epidemic, a localized event, whatever. And I listened to what he said and I internalized that. And then when I watched what he was doing, I thought, well, that's weird. He's not listening to himself. He's not doing what Anthony Fauci says to do. I find that interesting. But again, getting back to deferring to the experts, that poses a problem for someone who is thinking critically, observing, doing their due diligence to research things. That poses a problem. Ultimately, I have to make some sort of a decision on where I sit with respect to policy based on all of that. What I see, however, amongst the general population is a willingness to just go along with whatever the loudest voice in the room seems to be saying. The loudest voice in the room seems to me to be mainstream media, excluding Fox to a large degree, certainly excluding second-tier mainstream media. I don't know what, they might even be third-tier at this point. Here in Canada, Rebel News, True North, and then, of course, excluding all of the YouTube citizen journalists, opinion people, all the people out there. There's many of them, right? There's the Dave Rubins and the Stefan Molyneux of the world. There's the Steven Crowder even. There's the Young Turks. There's so many other sort of YouTube news, opinion, citizen journalists, even activists. Those seem to be relegated to a very small group of people that actually consume that media on top of the rest of the mainstream media and have nuanced views on things. We've all probably seen, well, I hope we have, the Hollywood Squares sort of esque version of the mainstream media, except there's way more squares. And what people have done, I've seen it on Twitter previously and on YouTube, is they've put into all the little boxes of the squares, it might be, I don't know, a 10 by 10 grid or even more maybe, of different news sources, different hosts and anchor people, all saying the same exact phrase. It's all in unison. Of course, they manipulated to be in unison, but it's, more importantly, it's all the sort of talking points. It's all the same thing. Now, you might say, well, when you're talking about the pandemic, well, the word pandemic is going to come up a lot. I'm not talking about the obvious cliche of the day. I'm talking about certain phrases, sort of like in a mushroom cloud, a little phrase that someone might use that's a number of words long that everybody seems to be saying all out of the blue. Like yesterday they weren't saying it. Today they're all saying it. And people seem to be really susceptible to that, which boggles my mind. I'm 52 years old. It's taken me this long to realize how susceptible a population is to what is being fed to them by people that I don't even know if they trust. I think it's just, the box is in the room, right? And so we're watching the box, and the box says, don't go anywhere, stay in your home. Anybody who wants to restart the economy is part of the greedhead class. If you want to keep the economy going, then what you really should do is choose one member of your family to sacrifice to the gods of the pandemic, so you'll know how it feels for someone else. False dichotomies of, the economy or your life, right? And that's not how any of that works. And there's not much nuanced information if you stick with CNN, MSNBC here in Canada, the CBC. There are a few good reporters within some of those platforms, but not a lot. I mean, it's certainly not in what I would call, at the risk of using a label, sort of modern left-wing media. Kind of most of it excluding Fox. And I don't see a lot of nuanced conversation, in particular on my own private Facebook feed. So admittedly, that's a self-selective population of people, but it's not comforting. And of course, I'm not just looking at that. I combine that with what I see on YouTube and I see on Twitter and I see in interviews on television and that sort of thing. And I just didn't realize, I don't think, that people were so susceptible to that uncritically. So if the media tells them that the Canadian federal government's doing a great job, then they're all for it. And it astounds me to see in a year when the rampant spending of our particular government, even over and above the deficits they had already promised that they were going to run, is shown to be so misguided, because it leaves us completely unprepared to face a situation like we're facing now, given that they're going to do a bunch of bailing out and they're going to lose a bunch of tax revenue, arguably, that people actually are responding to polls with the federal government, the Justin Trudeau government, as more favorable than they did when our last election was held. That's astounding to me, because I always thought that what you do has ramifications. And if you don't keep your house in order, if you mismanage your finances, that there are going to be ramifications, there are going to be repercussions from that. And here we're in a situation where that has occurred. And I guess because people have this false notion that we're all supposed to come together in a crisis or something. And there's many other scandals to be had. I mean, there's many other criticisms that a person could have over our federal government and their response to everything. They've been 3 steps behind every correct decision. So they made the wrong one first, and then they made the other one later, and then we're full of excuses why they made the wrong one before, or just dismiss it entirely. They get the real softball treatment from the media, and anyone who is critical of them, the labels right away come out. Oh, you're a racist. I made a remark to somebody recently about Theresa Tam actually admitted that the rollout of the, sort of border closures, which we never really did actually anyway, but the rollout of the border closures was probably a little bit too late. And I said, does she get to be called a racist now because she's critical of her own advisory, right? Because that's what happened here. Someone was critical, a white guy, of her and got labeled as being a racist because, of course, Theresa Tam should not face any criticism for her policy. He didn't mention race. I guess it's a get out of responsibility card. You need to be a minority woman of color or something, and then you can sidestep responsibility for bad decisions. And people rally around that. And again, it blows my mind that at the same time where across the border, the Trump administration is being asked if, I don't know what they said. The death rate at the time was, 3,000 people. I don't know if that was in a month or whatever it was. It was early on. And the reporter asked Donald Trump the question, that's like a 9/11 every month or something like that. Do you think that a president who resides over that kind of a death rate deserves to be reelected? So it's interesting to see, if you challenge my notion that the main, excluding Fox, the mainstream media is sort of left-leaning, then ask yourself the question why that is the question that's posed to Donald Trump, whereas here in Canada, it seems to be all softball, and the media is actually reporting that instead, that even though we just recently had a federal election, that Justin Trudeau might call another election in the fall because his favorability ratings now are such that were the election to be held today, he would have a majority government. Whereas right now, because of the last election, he has a minority government, and there's things that he's going to face a lot more pushback in trying to accomplish or do. If he were to have a majority government, obviously that would be, besides the ego boost and whatnot, feeding his ego, it would give him a lot more control. And that really blows my mind. So what to do about all that, I guess, is the question. With respect to a lot of the freedoms that people have sort of felt like we've lost, this sort of authoritarian top-down management of the crisis, rather than recognizing that, I have a few sayings that I say to people periodically. One, we've made some mistakes. We have idolized our celebrities and we've celebritized our politicians. I think those are mistakes. The other mistake is in forgetting that politicians work for us. They are public servants. We too often forget that, and they too often really forget that. So to remember that, I always cringe when I hear a politician saying, I really want to thank everyone for doing what they should do, doing the right thing. It's like, no, you work for me. And now you might think that wrong-headed, but I think it's important to remember that, because not only is that a pushback against that politician, and hopefully would cause, unlikely, but would cause them to engage in a little bit of introspection and go, oh, right, I'm not a god here. I don't get to rule from on high. I work for the people, and I always need to be aware of that. But it also puts the responsibility for my choices back on myself. I'm reminding myself that the government is not the boss of me, but they're also not the decider. They're also not responsible for doing what I would see as the right thing. I don't drink and drive just because it's against the law. I don't drink and drive, well, partially because I don't drink, but I'm damn near a teetotaler, but because I know it's not the right thing to do. And putting the responsibility, taking a responsibility away from the average person is a huge mistake. Because then it's sort of like, I remember the NASCAR rules. Back in the day, the NASCAR rules were whatever's not in the rule manual is kind of permissible, right? And then they found out that, people were doing all kinds of crazy stuff. And so then they had to come back later and they had to say, well, okay, now we're going to make very specific rules. And then whatever's not in the rule book is actually already not within the law. It's outlawed in absentia, basically. Here's what you're allowed to do. It's a book of, it used to be a book of prohibitions. Now it's a book of allowances, essentially. And anything that's not in the allowances is prohibited. But anyway, like I said, I think that it's a mistake to take away that responsibility from the average citizen. And I think it dumbs everybody down. People raise or lower, I think, to the level of expectations of them. And so if you reduce your expectations of people by having a bunch of dictates and a bunch of things that, the checklist of things they are and aren't allowed to do, that removes the responsibility of correct decision-making. And also it removes engagement in discourse, arguments, fine-tuning our reasoning behind why a certain policy ought to be what it is, et cetera, et cetera. So I've tried to engage in my own personal Facebook with a lot of very thoughtful commentary on what I think is going on. Maybe someday I'll even just read some off and record them for posterity, if nothing else. Now, some of them might be wrong-headed, and I've had a couple of people, challenge me on different notions that I put forth and whatnot, and that's good. That's a good thing. That's what I want. And I've had other people go, well, I never thought of it that way before. You're right. Thanks for, helping me see things clearly. And so going forward, we've had a lot of loss of liberty here, and there potentially is more with, track and trace and mandatory health passports or vaccinations or other things that are I think they're going to restrict a lot of people when it comes to international travel and other things. I'm not getting any younger. I've got, my next 12 years or so to sort of plan out in terms of my working life and what am I going to do there. It's very difficult what I do, and it's hard on me emotionally even as well, mentally. There's my wife's situation with her multiple sclerosis. She can no longer work. She faces day-to-day frustrations and difficulties. She's still able to have quite a quality of life, like a very good quality of life, but these things impact her quite a bit. I've had obviously the loss of my dad and the loss of my mom last year. And with all of the things going around and sort of my increasing level of disenchantment with my fellow globe mates, what to do, how to change my focus. I think it's a mistake. I think it's dangerous to get sort of nihilistic. And I think you need to always have the viewpoint that your best years are still ahead of you. You've got to have things to work towards. You got to have goals. You have to enjoy, different pursuits. And so, I think that's going to be maybe even a little bit more of my focus going forward, is to focus a little bit more on what I enjoy doing and fulfilling myself artistically as well as anything. I acquired some musical gear recently that I'm looking forward to messing with. I've always been into music, like creation, composing, and even just jamming with myself. So I'm looking forward to doing more of that. But I also think I need to find a way to restructure the way I absorb current events and other people's opinions and attitudes of them, while still being able to interject and put forth important points. I had started reading Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and there are a lot of things that he wrote about that occurred that I can see the nuclei of in the way people are behaving today. And it's human nature, right? Human behavior doesn't change all that much in the broader sense. You have a lot of variation. You have a lot of diversity within groups of people, like individuals within groups. There's a lot of diversity there. But when it comes to movements, when it comes to larger groups of people and the behavior of larger groups of people and the repetition of different patterns, there's not as much variation as a person might like. There's not as much, I would say, awakening as one would like to see. That's what concerns me. Lessons learned and forgotten, or lessons learned and not considered when they start again, when these patterns reveal themselves again in infancy, which is, of course, the time you want to catch them, right? You want to catch these things before they reach a critical mass where they can no longer be stopped. The tendency of people to want to control and manipulate other people is, I think, at the top of all of this heap. The people's unwillingness, ultimately, whether they really know it or not, whether they'd like to admit it or not, unwillingness to recognize that really, ultimately, they really want to control other people. I think, I watch a lot of, some of these shows, and I know a lot of people who've lived remotely, secluded lifestyles. And those are some of the few people, obviously, by nature of where they live, who don't have that desire. Live and let live. I just want to be left free. I want to be left to live my life. The majority of people, they don't seem to have that in them. And situations like we're currently going through seems to bring out the little tyrants. And I think when it's pointed out, when you say, well, look at what these people are doing, look at what the Karens are doing, for instance, or some of the politicians, the sort of more authoritarian types, even within a free society. When you point those things out, I think people think it's hyperbolic to say, yeah, but look at what happened in the past. Look at what those kind of things can lead to. You're being hyperbolic. Well, am I? Those things have a start somewhere. And ultimately, I think if it's not ethical behavior in the first place, it's not ethical behavior in the first place. Or at least we ought to have the discussion. And I'm not sure that the public at large is capable of that discussion. And again, that's disheartening to me. I'd like to engage in that discussion. So for instance, when it comes to the idea of health passports, or more importantly, mandatory vaccination, that changes the game when it comes to ethics. And I know we've discussed ethics on my channel before, in particular, secular objective morality, and is there such a thing, and how does that work? And when you're talking about, like my body, my choice, well, this complicates things, obviously. And it complicates things not just because people are saying, well, your behavior may negatively impact someone else, and you don't have the right to do that. You're imposing that upon them in a sense. So you must accept, say, for instance, in this case, this mandatory vaccination to that end. Now, the problem, of course, with that is that's a utilitarian argument. And people don't seem to notice or seem to understand that if you're going to put forth a principle like that, that your right to do as you please ends at the other person's nose, and that includes, in this case, a mandatory vaccination for this, that principle to be reasonable at all needs to be universalized. And I'm not sure they understand what the ramifications of that principle, universalized, would mean. Of course, you couldn't stop at that vaccine. You would have to do it for everyone. And of course, you would get into compound arguments about the effectiveness of vaccines and the potential ramifications. What about for children who don't seem to be a vector? And so you'd have all kinds of weird arguments back and forth about that. But it goes far beyond, of course, mandatory vaccinations. If you're going to start to say that anything you do through no decision of your own, but still that impacts another person adversely, you don't have the right to do. And so we're going to impose either restrictions on you, or we're going to impose positive moral obligations that can be enforced, right? Like, for instance, a mandatory vaccination. And I don't think people have thought those things through. It complicates the hot tub deliberations, I should say, because I sort of felt like I knew where I stood on ethics and morality before this. And not that I hadn't thought about things like this, but obviously when you're faced with people saying that you shouldn't be able to travel unless you have this passport, even though you're otherwise completely observably a healthy person. And it's kind of ironic too, because this also happens it comes on the heels of some attempts in the northwest of the USA to get rid of laws that would criminalize knowingly infecting someone with HIV, like doing it on purpose. So that's kind of weird. I would like to talk to some of those people and see how they square that circle, if they believe that forced vaccinations. And I have a feeling that probably some of them do. They're right on that bandwagon. And again, that's what concerns me. It was disheartening to see that people are so irrational that they can hold these different views simultaneously. And obviously, if I hold similar simultaneous contrary views, I'd like it pointed out by somebody. I'd like to engage in the argument, at least in the discussion. Anyway, that's enough rambling. I'm going to engage, obviously, in some introspection and try to figure out how I can manage my life going forward in terms of how do I engage without it being a negative for me personally, and without losing hope, without, falling down that dark well of nihilism, and, but still having some sort of a positive impact maybe on the people around me. I'm not talking about YouTube so much. I think here there's more back and forth. I'm not sure that there's that much benefit coming from me, but more importantly, just in my personal life with the people that I engage with on Facebook, their family, friends, and former schoolmates, essentially there. And so how can I manage that? How can I navigate through that world? And I'd be interested to hear what you think on that, what you might be going through as well in regards to the same thing. I'd like to know if people share my my ever increasing frustration with, our fellow citizens in terms of critical thinking, in terms of holding leadership to account, as we should, as is our duty, I believe, for their mistakes, and to change them as necessary, just like a diaper, and for the same reason. Thanks for watching. Bye for now. Hi, everyone. I was kind of hoping I'd have better lighting for this video. For some reason, the way the sun is behind the clouds, wow, that's awful. Well, here's something I haven't tried before. Useless.